The story doesn't begin with battle. It begins with inevitability. Because by the year 1177, everyone already knew how this was supposed to end. Jerusalem was not preparing for war. It was preparing for its own funeral. For nearly a century, Christian kingdoms had clung to the Holy Land like a man gripping the edge of a cliff with bloodied fingers. Every fortress, every wall, every narrow victory had bought them time. But time was running out. And now, that time had almost completely disappeared. Across the horizon, a storm was rising. Not a storm of wind or rain, but of steel, banners, and belief an empire had awakened. And at its center stood a man whose name alone could empty cities before a single arrow was fired. Saladin, he was not just a commander. He was something far more dangerous. A unifier, a visionary, a man who had done what no one else could. He had brought together Egypt and Syria under one purpose, one faith, one unstoppable force. Armies followed him not just because they were ordered to, but because they believed in him. And belief is more powerful than fear. His soldiers had marched through battle after battle without tasting defeat. They had crushed armies, shattered alliances, and watched as fortress after fortress fell like dominoes in their path at BY 1177. His power stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. And Jerusalem was next. Everyone knew it. The nobles knew it. The merchants knew it. Even the priests, who spoke of miracles and divine protection, quietly made arrangements. Ships were being prepared in secret. Gold was being hidden. Escape routes were whispered behind closed doors. Because when 26,000 of the finest warriors in the known world begin moving toward your city, you don't plan for victory. You plan for survival. And yet, on the throne of this dying kingdom sat something no one could understand, a boy 16 years old, a king, whose own body was betraying him. Baldwin IV, they called him the Leper King, a name spoken with equal parts fear, pity, and disbelief. Because leprosy in that time was not just a disease, it was a sentence, a curse. People believed it was the mark of divine judgment, a punishment. From God himself, flesh didn't just weaken, it disappeared. Nerves died, pain vanished, and with it control. Fingers couldn't feel, hands couldn't grip, faces lost their shape. And by 16, Baldwin was already losing. His hands were wrapped constantly in silk bandages, not for comfort, but to hide what they had become. His skin beneath was pale, damaged, decaying. He could barely hold a sword. Sometimes, he couldn't even feel it in his hand. His face, once that of a boy, was hidden behind a silver mask, crafted not for intimidation, but necessity, because the truth underneath was too much for people to see. Courtiers whispered. Servants avoided his gaze. Even his allies wondered the same silent question. How can a king who cannot feel his own body defend a kingdom? But what they didn't understand, what no one understood yet, was that Baldwin had already accepted something they had not. He knew he was dying. Not someday. Not in the distant future. Soon. Maybe months. Maybe a few years if God was merciful. Every breath he took was borrowed time. And when a man truly understands that, fear disappears. Because what can you threaten him with? Pain. He cannot feel it. Death? He's already walking toward it. Loss? He has nothing left to lose. That is what made Baldwin dangerous. Not his army, not his strength, but his clarity. While others planned escape routes, he was planning something else entirely. Something no one expected. Something no one believed was even possible. Because while Jerusalem prepared to fall, Baldwin refused to accept the ending written for him. And far to the south, Saladin was already moving. His army, 26,000 strong, began its march like a living tide rolling across the land. Cavalry stretched across miles. Banners filled the sky like dark wings. The ground trembled beneath thousands of hooves. This was not a raid. This was not a test. This was conquest. Supply trains follow behind them. Massive, heavy, filled with gold, food, weapons, everything needed to sustain a long campaign. You don't bring that kind of weight unless you expect to win. Unless you expect the war to be over soon. Saladin wasn't coming to fight for Jerusalem, he was coming to take it. And in his mind, it was already his, because what could stand against him? A fractured kingdom that a handful of scattered knights, and a dying boy who couldn't even hold a sword properly. Even his own commanders were already dividing the future among themselves. This land will be mine. That fortress will fall to me. They spoke as if the battle had already been fought, as if history had already been written. And maybe they were right. Because by every measure, every number, every law of war, they were unstoppable. And yet, something had begun to shift. Because in Jerusalem, while others whispered about escape, while others counted the days, Baldwin made a decision so reckless, so impossible, that when he spoke it aloud, even his most loyal knights felt something close to fear. He would not wait behind the walls, that he would not hide, that he would not negotiate, that he would go out and meet Saladin. Not with an army, but with whatever he had left. And that was barely enough to call a force 500 knights. That was at 500 against 26,000, even saying it feels absurd to 52 enemies for everyone, and IT wasn't a battle plan, that IT was a death sentence. And yet, for the first time since the invasion began, something changed. Not in numbers, not in strength, but in something far more dangerous: belief. Because when the knights looked at their king, really looked at him, at the bandaged hands, at the silver mask, at the body that was clearly breaking, and still saw him choosing to ride in a certain death, something inside them ignited. If a dying king could face the impossible, how could they do anything less? And that was the moment the story truly began. Not on a battlefield, not at the charge, but here, in a decision that should have led to total annihilation. Because what Baldwin was about to do would either end his kingdom in a single day, or create a legend that would echo through history forever. And far ahead, Saladin's army marched on, completely unaware that they were walking straight towards something they had never faced before. Not just an enemy, but a force that had already accepted death, and therefore could not be defeated the way normal men are. Jerusalem wasn't supposed to fight. It was supposed to survive just a little longer, just enough time for its people to escape, for its nobles to secure their future somewhere safer, somewhere far from the shadow that was already stretching across the land. But inside the throne room, everything changed the moment Baldwin IV refused to accept that ending. Because while his advisors spoke of caution and retreat and survival, he saw something they didn't. He saw time running out not just for the kingdom, but for himself. And that changed everything about the way he thought, because a man who knows he is dying soon does not think in terms of safety. He thinks in terms of meaning. And so when they told him to stay behind the walls, to let Saladin come and break himself against stone, to preserve what little strength remained, Baldwin listened in silence, his bandaged hands resting in his lap, his body already exhausted from simply existing. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that cut through the room like a blade, saying he would not die hiding behind walls. He would not let Jerusalem fall without a fight. And if the end was coming, then he would meet in the open, facing the enemy, not waiting for them. And those words didn't just shock the room, they terrified it, because this was not strategy, this was defiance of reality itself. This was a dying king choosing movement over safety, choosing action over logic. And yet once the words were spoken, something irreversible had begun, because you cannot hear a king speak like that and then return to quiet surrender. And so preparations began, not for defense, but for something far more dangerous, a march, a desperate, impossible march toward an army that outnumbered them beyond comprehension. And when the counts were finally made, when every knight who could still ride was gathered, when every man willing to follow a dying king into what was almost certainly death stepped forward, the number stood at 500, just 500 knights, and even that number carried weight, because among them were 80 Knights Templar, warriors who had sworn oaths that made them something more than soldiers, men who did not retreat, who did not surrender, who believed that dying in battle was not loss but victory, and behind them a few thousand infantry, poorly trained compared to the elite forces they would face, but still willing, still present, still part of something that no longer made sense on paper. And as this force gathered, as armor was strapped on and weapons were checked, there was no illusion among them. No false confidence. They all knew the numbers. They all understood what they were walking into. And yet they stayed, because belief had begun to replace reason. And at the center of it all was Baldwin, who could barely stand without assistance, who had to be helped into his armor piece by piece, whose hands needed to be guided just to hold his sword. And even then, the grip was uncertain, unreliable, like the weapon itself might slip away at any moment. And when it came time for him to mount his horse, it became painfully clear just how far gone his body was, because he could not climb into the saddle on his own. He had to be lifted carefully, slowly, as if he might break under the strain. And once he was there, they secured him, literally fastening him in place, because his legs no longer had the strength to hold him steady. And for a moment, just a brief moment, the reality of it all hung in the air. A king who could not feel his own hands, who could barely control his own body, about to lead an army into the greatest battle of its existence. And then he gave the order to move, and just like that, the impossible became real, because they did not stay behind the safety of Jerusalem's walls. They rode out, leaving the city behind, leaving the only real protection they had, and heading directly towards Saladin, who at that very moment was advancing with complete confidence, his army spreading across the land, foraging, gathering supplies, moving like a force that had already won, because in his mind there was no threat left, no army capable of stopping him, certainly not one led by a boy king with a disease that was slowly killing him. And that assumption, that single belief that Baldwin would never dare leave Jerusalem, was the first crack in everything that followed. Because while Saladin's forces relaxed, spreading out, across miles of countryside, discipline loosening, formation breaking into smaller groups, Baldwin's army moved with urgency, with desperation, pushing themselves far beyond what should have been possible, covering distance at a pace that exhausted even the strongest among them. Horses foaming, men struggling to stay upright in their saddles, and at times Baldwin himself losing consciousness from the sheer strain, his body shutting down under the pressure, only to be carried forward on a litter, when he could no longer remain mounted. And still they did not stop, because stopping meant death, stopping meant Jerusalem would fall. And so they pushed forward through pain, through exhaustion, through the growing awareness that they were marching toward something no one survives. And yet as they moved, something unexpected began to happen. Reports started coming in. Small pieces of information that didn't seem important at first, but slowly began to form a different picture. Saladin's army was not fully gathered, not tightly organized. It was spread out, scattered across the land, its sheer size becoming a weakness instead of a strength. Units separated by distance. Communication slowed. Coordination weakened. And Baldwin, despite everything his body was suffering, understood what that meant, because for the first time since this entire disaster had begun, there was an opportunity, not a good one, not a safe one, but a real one, a chance to strike not at a unified army, but at a divided one, to hit them before they could come together, before their overwhelming numbers could be brought to bear. And that realization changed everything, because now this was no longer just a march to die with honor. It was something else, something far more dangerous, a gamble, a single moment where everything could either collapse instantly or turn in a way no one thought possible. And by the time the sun began to rise on November 25th, Baldwin's exhausted force had reached the point where that decision would have to be made, because ahead of them, stretching across the land like a living ocean, was Saladin's army, vast, powerful, and completely unaware of what was about to hit it. And for the first time, the knights who had followed Baldwin began to understand what he had been seeing all along. Not victory, not certainty, but a moment, a single, fragile moment where the impossible might actually be attempted. And once that moment passed, there would be no second chance, no retreat, no recovery, just the end, one way or another. By the time the sun fully rose over the plains on November 25th, Baldwin's army was already beyond exhaustion. Horses trembling beneath armored weight, men barely able to keep their eyes open after the brutal forced march, armor digging into bruised bodies, throats dry from dust and fear. But none of that mattered anymore, because ahead of them, stretching across the land like something alive, was Saladin's army. And for a moment, just a moment, everything slowed because no matter how much they had prepared themselves mentally, no matter how much they had accepted death, nothing could truly prepare a man for the sight of 26,000 warriors spread across miles of open ground, banners rising and falling in the wind like waves, sunlight flashing across thousands of blades, movement everywhere, cavalry shifting, men calling out, the sheer scale of it overwhelming in a way that made the number feel even larger than it was. And in that moment, reality pressed down hard. This was not a raid, not a skirmish. This was an empire on the move, and there were 500 knights standing in front of it. Some of Baldwin's men began to pray under their breath. Others tightened their grip on their weapons, and a few simply stared, unable to process what they were about to do, because instinct, training, every lesson they had ever learned about war screamed the same thing. Wait, fall back, find ground. Do anything except charge directly into that. But Baldwin didn't give them time to think like that, because he knew something they were only just beginning to understand. Hesitation would kill them, faster than any sword. And so before doubt could spread, before fear could take root, he gave the order to halt, not to retreat, not to reposition, to prepare. And that alone was enough to send a ripple through the ranks, because they realized what was coming before he even said it. Meanwhile, across the field, Saladin's forces were still in motion, not in formation, not in battle lines, but scattered, stretched thin as foraging parties moved independently, supply lines lagging behind commanders, trying to maintain some sense of structure across an army simply too large to control perfectly in open terrain. And when the first reports came in, dust on the horizon, movement from the north, the reaction in Saladin's camp was almost casual, because it didn't make sense. There shouldn't be an army there, not one willing to engage, certainly not Baldwin. And so the assumption was simple, a scouting force, maybe a small harassment unit, nothing worth concern, nothing that required immediate action. And that assumption, that small moment of dismissal, was the second crack, the one that would widen into something catastrophic. Because by the time the truth began to spread through the Muslim ranks, by the time banners were identified, by the time someone realized that this wasn't a scouting party, but the main force of Jerusalem itself, it was already too late to react cleanly. Because an army spread across miles does not become a single unit instantly. It takes time, orders have to travel, units have to regroup, formations have to be rebuilt, and time was the one thing Baldwin refused to give them. Back on the ridge, Baldwin was being lifted once again onto his horse, his body barely responding, his strength nearly gone from the march alone. And yet when they secured him into the saddle, when the straps were tightened to hold him upright, something in his posture changed, not physically stronger, but mentally fixed, like a man who had already crossed the line between life and death and found peace there. And as his knights formed around him, the Templars moving to the front, their black and white banners snapping in the wind, he raised his bandaged hand, slowly, deliberately, and every man watching felt it. This was it. This was the point where everything ended or began. And he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, and the words passed through the ranks like fire, reminding them that they were not just fighting an army. They were fighting for something greater, something eternal, something worth dying for. And whether each man believed that fully or simply needed to believe it in that moment didn't matter. Because belief, even temporary, is enough to change how a man fights. Across the field, panic was beginning to stir. Not full panic yet, but confusion, movement without direction, commanders shouting orders that took too long to reach their targets. Units tried to reform while others were still unaware. Anything was wrong. And in the center of it all, Saladin watched as the situation unfolded in a way that didn't fit any pattern he knew, because armies did not behave like this. Enemies did not charge when outnumbered 50-1. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't logic, it was madness. And for a brief moment, even he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of disbelief, trying to understand what he was seeing before reacting to it. That hesitation cost him everything, because Baldwin did not wait. He did not allow the lines to form. He did not allow the numbers to matter. Exactly the moment when Saladin's army was at its most vulnerable, scattered, disorganized, unprepared, Baldwin gave the signal point, 500 lances lowered almost as one. The sound of wood and metal shifting into position, cutting through the air, and then, without pause, without second thought, they moved at T first. It was controlled. A forward push, hooves striking the ground in rhythm, armor clinking, banners lifting, and then it became faster, the line tightening, the formation sharpening into something focused, something deadly. And within seconds, it was no longer a movement. It was a charge. And not just any charge, but one that made no sense to the men watching it. Because from the perspective of Saladin's front ranks, what they saw was impossible. A thin line of knights accelerating toward them, not slowing, not hesitating, not turning aside, but coming straight on, directly into the heart of an army that should have swallowed them whole. And for a few crucial seconds, those front ranks didn't react properly, because the human mind needs time to process something that defies expectation, and Baldwin stole that time from them. Arrows began to fly, scattered at first, then more concentrated as archers realized what was happening. Dark shapes cutting through the air toward the charging knights, some finding their marks, horses collapsing, riders thrown, the front line taking losses even before. Impact, but the charge did not break, it did not slow, because momentum had taken over, and once a cavalry charge reaches that point, stopping is no longer an option. The ground began to shake as the distance closed, the sound building into something overwhelming, hooves, metal, voices, all blending into a single force of noise that rolled across the field like thunder, and still, unbelievably, they kept coming 50 yards. Muslim cavalry trying to form, struggling to align themselves, to brace. For impact that shouldn't have been happening this way, 40 yards. Horses beginning to panic, sensing what was coming even if their riders did not 30 yards. The Templars at the front lowering their lances fully, bodies locked, eyes fixed ahead, not on survival, but on impact. And at the center of it all, Baldwin, strapped to his saddle, barely able to feel the weapon in his own hand, raising it anyway, leading not with strength, but with presence, with the simple fact that he was there at the front, where no king in his condition should have been 20 yards. The moment stretched, time compressing, every man aware that the next heartbeat would decide everything. And then they hit. The collision didn't feel like battle. It felt like the world itself breaking, because when 500 armored knights hit a force that hadn't fully formed, the result wasn't a clean clash of lines. It was a violent tearing apart of everything in front of them. The Templars at the tip of the charge, driving forward like a living spear, their lances hitting with such force that men were thrown from saddles, bodies crushed under hooves before they even hit the ground. And in those first seconds, there was no resistance, only shock, because the front ranks of Saladin's army had not braced properly, they had not aligned, they had not prepared for impact, and that single failure turned what should have been a solid wall into something fragile, something that shattered instead of holding. Sound alone was enough to break men, with splintering as lances shattered on impact, metal ringing as blades met armor, horses screaming as they collided and fell, and beneath it all, the constant thunder of hooves driving forward, because Baldwin's knights did not stop at the first line, they didn't slow, they didn't pull back as cavalry often did after a charge. They kept going, pushing deeper, forcing the gap wider, turning a moment of disruption into something far more dangerous, something that spread. Behind the Templars, the rest of the knights followed immediately, not giving the enemy even a second to recover, striking the same point, widening the tear, turning confusion into panic. And that was the moment where something shifted, something subtle but deadly, because battles are not won only with strength, they are won in the mind. And in that instant, the idea of invincibility that had surrounded Saladin's army began to crack. Men who had never been pushed back before were moving backward, not running yet, not breaking, but giving ground. And in a battle of this size, even a single step backward can spread like fire. Saladin's commanders shouted orders, trying to stabilize the center, trying to pull units together, to form lines, to push back against what should have been a small, containable threat. But the problem wasn't just the attack. It was when it happened, because units were still too far apart, communication too slow. And every second that passed allowed Baldwin's knights to drive deeper, to turn that initial impact into something that could not be undone easily. Arrows continued to fall, more organized now, striking into the mass of knights, bringing down horses, killing riders, slowing momentum in places. But not enough. Not yet, because momentum had already done its work. It had created a hole, and now that hole was widening into something far more dangerous than a simple breach. And then something happened that no one on that field expected. The knights didn't hesitate. They didn't pull back to regroup. They didn't fight cautiously, preserving their strength against overwhelming numbers. They fought like men who had already accepted death. And that changes everything. Because when one side fights to survive and the other fights with nothing left to lose, the rules shift in ways that are almost impossible to predict. Templars drove forward even after losing their lances, switching to swords, to maces, to anything they could use, striking at close range, not caring about formation anymore, only about pushing deeper, breaking more, spreading fear faster than the enemy could contain it. And behind them, Baldwin's knights follow that same energy, turning what should have been a single strike into continuous pressure, never allowing the Muslim center to stabilize a T around that moment. Something even more dangerous began to take shape, that on Saladin's left flank, a unit of cavalry, seeing the center being pushed, hesitated just for a second, just a small shift. Backward, a slight repositioning to avoid being caught in the chaos. But hesitation in battle is contagious. The men next to them saw it. Then the next, and suddenly that small movement became a drift. Not a retreat. Not yet, but a loss of confidence. And once confidence starts to fade in an army that large, it doesn't fade slowly. It collapses, because those men had never seen this before. They had never seen their own center give ground, never seen an enemy charge like this, never felt this kind of pressure from such a small force. And their minds struggled to make sense of it, because if 500 knights could do this, what else was coming? And that question, that single doubt, began to spread faster than any command could stop. I ate the tea the same time. Baldwin's infantry, the part of his force that had seemed almost irrelevant compared to the knights, suddenly appeared where they weren't expected, moving into position, striking at exposed sides, adding to the illusion that the crusader force was larger than it really was. And that illusion mattered more than the actual numbers, because from within the chaos of the battlefield, no one had a clear view, no one could count, no one could measure, they could only feel, and what they felt was pressure from multiple directions. Shouts began to rise. We're being surrounded. It wasn't true. Not really, but it didn't have to be. Because once enough men believe it, it becomes real in their actions. And that was the moment where the battle tipped. Not completely, not instantly, but enough that what followed became possible. Because now it wasn't just a fight, that it was fear spreading through an army that had never known it like this. Saladin himself, at the center of it all, could see the danger forming, could feel the shift in momentum. And he tried to respond, tried to rally his men, to bring order back into the chaos. But even for a commander of his skill, there are moments when control slips away, not because of lack of ability, but because events move faster than orders can travel. And this was one of those moments, because Baldwin had done the one thing no one expected. He hadn't tried to fight the whole army. He had broken it before it could become one dot, and now, with the center collapsing inward, with flanks beginning to lose confidence, with panic just starting to take hold, the situation was no longer stable. It was unraveling. And once an army of 26,000 begins to unravel, stopping it becomes almost impossible. Once the first cracks appeared in the Muslim lines, everything accelerated. Hesitation became panic. Units that had held firm for decades, warriors who had never known defeat, began to step backward, then stumble, then run. Horses sensed it first. Animals trained to charge, to face death on a battlefield, now bolted, dragging riders with them, trampling their own comrades in sheer terror. The Mamluks, Saladin's elite, the pride of his army, men who had faced Mongols, Byzantines, and Nubians without blinking, froze first in disbelief and then broke. One by one, they turned, abandoning formation, abandoning discipline, abandoning their commander. Saladin watched from his position, heart hammering in a way he had never felt in battle. He tried to rally his men, shouted commands, tried to reform the lines, but every order traveled too slowly. Every attempt at control arrived after the chaos had already spread. And then, in a moment chroniclers would never forget, the impossible happened. His personal guard, the 2,000 Mamluks who had sworn death before dishonor, panicked and fled. Their golden armor flashed in the sun as they scrambled onto horses and camels, scattering across the field. And when the Sultan himself mounted a racing camel to escape the carnage, the psychological blow to the remaining troops was catastrophic. Everywhere, Muslim banners toppled, dust clouds rising where men and horses collided, some trampled, some fighting, but all retreating. The retreat itself became a slaughter. Baldwin's knights didn't stop at breaking the line. They surged forward, turning disorder into annihilation. Lances shattered, swords swung in arcs of death. Horses tore through fleeing formations, hooves crushing bodies as men and mounts collided in a tangle of panic. Baldwin, strapped to his saddle, his hands wrapped and ravaged by leprosy, somehow remained at the front, directing the charge, raising his sword when he could, inspiring his knights with sheer presence alone. Every movement, every command, every glance from him was magnified, a force multiplier far beyond his physical limitations. The ravines on the field, which would have been merely obstacles under normal circumstances, became death traps. Men fled into them, trying to escape the charging knights, only to fall into layers of bodies, suffocating under the weight of their comrades. And yet the knights pressed on, trampling, striking, pushing relentlessly. By mid-afternoon, the psychological collapse was complete. Units scattered, regrouping impossible, morale non-existent. Even seasoned warriors who had faced death hundreds of times were gone, swept away by the sheer momentum of a force that should never have existed. 500 knights, a few thousand infantry, charging an army 52 times their size at BY 3:30 p.m. Pursuit became methodical slaughter. Baldwin's knights chased down fleeing soldiers for miles, refusing to let them regroup. Horses, exhausted from the forced march earlier that morning, somehow found strength to continue, as if the desperation and faith of their riders flowed into them. Captured weapons and gold piled up behind the Crusaders, a trove of spoils from an army meant to overwhelm them. Muslim chroniclers called it divine punishment. Christian chroniclers called it miracle. By sunset, the field was covered with the bodies of the fallen, 20,000 dead from the Sultan's army. The impossible had happened. In the midst of it all, Baldwin survived barely, yet still upright, still commanding, still leading. He allowed himself to be lifted from his horse only when the sun began to dip low, collapsing onto littered earth, surrounded by men who had seen death and somehow survived. Yet even in exhaustion, he raised his bandaged hands one final time for prayer, giving glory not to himself, not to his knights, but to God, acknowledging that this victory, as improbable as it was, belonged to something far greater than mortal strength. Saladin's name, once synonymous with invincibility, became a whisper of humiliation. His elite army shattered in hours, his reputation tarnished, the psychological shock echoing across the Islamic world. Baldwin's kingdom, bankrupt and on the brink, now held gold, weapons, and supplies to sustain itself for years. The impossible had been achieved, not through numbers, not through power, but through courage, faith, and tactical brilliance. The Battle of Montcassard would echo for centuries. It was the last great Crusader victory in the Holy Land, a moment where 500 men defied logic, history, and expectation, led by a boy king whose body betrayed him, but whose spirit could not be broken. The field that evening was silent, but for the groans of the wounded and the whispered prayers of the survivors, a testament to how faith, courage, and audacity can overturn even the most absolute odds. Baldwin IV's victory bought time, a decade of survival for Jerusalem, but it came at a cost. The physical toll on the Leper King was extreme, yet he endured, still leading, still inspiring. still proving that leadership is not measured by numbers, but by the will to act when all else says retreat. History would remember this day not just as a battle, but as proof that impossible odds can be overcome when resolve meets opportunity. And when a dying boy king refuses to accept defeat, as the sun set over the blood-soaked plains of Montgassard, Baldwin IV allowed himself a moment to breathe. Though it was shallow, painful, every movement a reminder that his body was failing, that leprosy had already taken so much and would take more. His knights surrounded him, exhausted, bloodied, armor dented, but alive. The field was littered with the remnants of Saladin's army, twisted bodies, broken weapons, abandoned banners, and the spoils of an empire's campaign now in the hands of a handful of men who had fought and won against impossible odds. Baldwin did not celebrate. He knelt instead, his bandaged hands raised in prayer, murmuring the words that would echo through history. Non nobis domini, non nobis sed nomini tua de gloriam. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. And in that moment, the knights joined him, a congregation of warriors kneeling in awe, not of victory itself, but the man who had led them to it, a king whose body was failing yet whose mind, courage, and what could command the impossible. The immediate aftermath was staggering. Of the 26,000 men who had risen that morning under Saladin's banners, fewer than 2,000 survived to see nightfall. Jerusalem now possessed the material means to survive, with captured gold, weapons, and horses enough to reinforce every fortress in the kingdom. The Crusader states, so often fractured and weak, had been gifted a reprieve that no one expected, a decade of breathing space in a region where death and conquest had seemed inevitable. Yet Baldwin did not linger on the spoils or the glory. His body demanded attention, each breath labored, every step agony. Physicians warned him that the exertion had brought him to the edge of life itself. And yet he continued, because for Baldwin IV, leadership was not optional, and he could not allow weakness to show before those who depended on him. For the next 8 years, Baldwin continued to reign, each year a miracle of endurance. Despite blindness, paralysis, and pain that would have crushed any ordinary man, he commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and maintained the fragile network of alliances that kept Jerusalem standing. He was the embodiment of defiance against fate, a living proof that courage and intellect could achieve what raw strength alone could not. The shadow of Montgassard haunted Saladin, who would never forget how an army that should have been annihilated had instead destroyed his finest forces, leaving him humiliated and cautious for the rest of the decade. Yet the tragedy of Baldwin's life was inseparable from its triumph. In 1185, at just 24 years old, he finally succumbed to the disease that had defined his existence. His death marked the end of an era. The kingdom he had saved with 500 knights and unbreakable could not survive his loss. Saladin would reconquer Jerusalem 2 years later, but the memory of Montgassard remained, a testament to audacity, leadership, and the way belief could tip the scales when all else seemed lost. The Battle of Montgassard is remembered not just as a military engagement, but as the ultimate example of overcoming impossible odds. It is studied by historians and strategists as a case where morale, audacity, and psychological understanding outweighed sheer numbers. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, remains a symbol of courage transcending physical limitation, a boy whose body betrayed him, yet whose mind and spirit reshaped history. The field, once a site of carnage, became a lesson. Leadership and faith can defy mathematics, and even the most powerful army is vulnerable to the unexpected when resolve and ingenuity guide a smaller force. When the Chronicles were written, both Christian and Muslim historians struggled to comprehend what had happened. Christian sources called it divine intervention, a miracle granted to the faithful. Muslim sources, though sympathetic, described it as a catastrophe sent by God, a day when even the finest warriors were powerless before courage and determination beyond comprehension. Centuries later, military scholars continue to analyze the battle, recognizing that Baldwin's genius was not just tactical, but psychological. He forced fear into an army that had never known it and used timing, terrain, and sheer audacity to create a victory that should have been impossible. And so the legacy endures. A dying teenage king with bandaged hands held back the tide of history itself, proving that sometimes courage, will, and faith matter more than numbers, more than strength, more than strategy alone. Montcassard became a story of hope against overwhelming odds, a reminder that leadership can make the impossible inevitable, and that even in the face of despair, one person's resolve can change the course of nations. Baldwin IV did not just fight a battle. He wrote a legend, one that echoes across time. A final triumph carved into memory, a testament to the power of the human spirit against fate, disease, and overwhelming odds. Even after the dust settled and the bodies were buried, or left where they fell, Baldwin's victory sent shockwaves through the Levant. Word traveled faster than any messenger could carry it. Villages, towns, and even distant fortresses spoke in hushed, awed tones of the day when 500 knights had shattered Saladin's might. Cruzader morale sword. Knights who had doubted their own courage found new fire, while Muslim forces reeled in disbelief. The psychological impact was as great as the physical, and in the following months, Baldwin leveraged it expertly, using the aura of Montcassard to negotiate, intimidate, and inspire allies that he knew the fragility of his position. The kingdom was small, surrounded by enemies, dependent on fortresses and lacking manpower. But after Montcassard, he could bargain with confidence. Ambassadors approached differently. Even Saladin, humiliated but alive, began to approach negotiations with caution. The Sultan respected Baldwin now, though perhaps with fear. In the years following, the Christian kingdoms of the Levant enjoyed a rare reprieve, gaining precious time to reinforce fortifications, train new troops, and maintain tenuous control over territories that might otherwise have fallen. Baldwin himself, however, was increasingly bound to his body. Leprosy ravaged him further. He could barely stand, could not walk without support, could not see, and yet he remained king. He adapted, holding counsel from his throne on litter or throne chair, listening to reports, giving orders, making decisions that few could dispute. The man who had led a charge at Montcassard could no longer ride a horse, could no longer even hold a sword. But his mind was unbroken, sharp, precise. The aura of Montcassard became his shield. Knights and soldiers who saw him knew they followed a leader whose courage had already altered the course of history. During these years, Baldwin's leadership took on a different form. No longer a battlefield commander, he became a strategist, a diplomat, a king who ruled by intellect and reputation rather than physical prowess. Every letter he sent, every decision he made, carried the weight of the field at Montcassard. His enemies, while strong and numerous, hesitated before acting decisively, knowing the boy who had turned 500 men into a force capable of routing 26,000 once and could do so again if provoked. The memory of that November day became a weapon, one Baldwin wielded without moving from his chamber. And yet, the boy king remained acutely aware of his mortality. Each day was measured, not in victories or defeats, but in breaths, in how long he could continue to lead, how long he could maintain the fragile thread upon which Jerusalem's survival hung. He saw the future clearly. Saladin would recover, armies would return, and the kingdom would face new threats. His victory at Montcassard, miraculous as it was, bought time, not immortality. But Baldwin accepted this without despair. He understood that history rarely rewards longevity, but it remembers audacity, courage, and brilliance. By 1185, Baldwin's health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer participate in governance effectively. Blind, paralyzed, frail, he nonetheless continued to meet with counselors, dictate orders, and inspire those around him. When he finally died at 24, it was not in battle, but in the quiet of his royal chamber, a man who had defied fate, disease, and overwhelming odds. His passing left a vacuum that could not be filled. The kingdom he had saved would soon crumble without his guidance. and Saladin would reclaim Jerusalem 2 years later, as the chroniclers noted with grim inevitability. Yet Montgessard endured in memory. It became a benchmark for impossible victories, a story told to inspire knights and commanders for generations. The battle demonstrated that leadership, faith, and audacity can outweigh sheer numbers. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, became legend, not because he was undefeated. He was mortal, fragile, and would die young, but because he showed the world what courage and genius can achieve when combined, and how a single human being, against all odds, can alter the course of history. The shadow of Montgessard lingered. Military historians centuries later studied it for insights into morale, psychological warfare, and the role of audacity in battle. The Christian kingdoms survived longer than expected. The Crusader states gained years of stability they might otherwise have lost, and Saladin himself learned the limits of numbers and reputation when confronted by fearlessness and tactical brilliance. Baldwin's legacy was not merely survival. It was proof that human will, when fully committed, could make the impossible real, could turn desperation into triumph, could leave echoes that outlast armies and empires alike. Even today, the story resonates. A dying teenager with hands ravaged by leprosy, a silver mask hiding his suffering, leading 500 men to destroy an army 52 times their size. A king who should have been a footnote instead became immortal in history, a symbol that courage, strategy, and faith can bend reality itself. Montgessard was the culmination of a life defined by impossible odds, and its reverberations shaped the fate of the Holy Land long after Baldwin had passed from the world. The shockwaves of Montgessard didn't end with the battlefield. Every ruler, emir, and warlord in the Levant took notice. A teenage king had shattered the might of Saladin, and the reverberations altered alliances, strategies, and ambitions for years to come. Baldwin IV, though confined by his body, became a figure of myth, his victory empowering knights in fortresses across the region, inspiring troops in Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre, while simultaneously striking fear and caution into Muslim commanders. The very idea that a small, desperate force could defeat overwhelming numbers forced them to reconsider their campaigns and their assumptions. Yet Montgessard was just one moment in a longer struggle that had been unfolding for decades. The Holy Land was a cauldron of political intrigue, shifting alliances and territorial ambitions. While Baldwin's forces celebrated, Saladin retreated to regroup, but the damage had already been done. His aura of invincibility, built over years of campaigns from Egypt to Syria, was shaken. And in that vacuum of uncertainty, rival lords and neighboring powers began maneuvering. Baldwin's victory gave the Crusader states a rare but fleeting upper hand, allowing them to reassert influence over territories that had been slipping from their control. And here's where the story begins to bridge naturally into another tale, one almost as dramatic and blood-soaked, that of the rise of the Mamluks. While Saladin rebuilt his forces, Europe's attention was elsewhere, with news of Baldwin's miraculous victory inspiring reinforcements, crusading knights, and mercenaries to venture east. Among these new arrivals were men whose fates would intertwine with the remnants of Saladin's army in the decades to follow. Saladin's defeat exposed vulnerabilities that would later influence the formation of elite military units in the Muslim world. The chaos at Montgessard, the panic, the collapse of seasoned Mamluks, showed that raw skill alone was insufficient without morale, coordination, and leadership that adapted in real time. These lessons would echo as the Mamluks rose in Egypt, forming a military caste trained from childhood to be disciplined, loyal, and almost impossible to rout. Baldwin's victory, therefore, indirectly shaped the very enemies the Crusaders would face in the century to come. Meanwhile, Baldwin's own court, though invigorated by the victory, could not ignore the strategic reality. Saladin would not stay defeated forever. News trickled in of him consolidating his forces in Egypt and Syria, rebuilding, recruiting, and preparing for the inevitable clash. Baldwin, aware of his own mortality, began training and mentoring new leaders, preparing men like Raymond of Tripoli and Guy of Lusignan to take command in his stead. Every decision, every deployment, every treaty became a chess move because the region's conflicts were about more than one battle. They were about survival, power, and legacy. As winter turned to spring, Baldwin's court saw an unexpected flurry of activity. Intelligence reports of troop movements, the construction of fortifications, and negotiations with neighboring Muslim and Christian lords filled the halls. Baldwin, despite being physically incapacitated, followed every development, issuing instructions, adjusting deployments, and using the memory of Montgassard as a psychological tool. When commanders hesitated, he reminded them of that day, of the impossible victory, instilling confidence that no setback was permanent if courage and strategy were applied. And here, the story begins to flow into broader history, because Baldwin's survival and Montgassard's victory bought the Crusader states time, yes, but they also delayed the inevitable. Over the next years, the struggle between Jerusalem and Saladin's forces would continue, with skirmishes, sieges, and political maneuvering, each echoing the lessons of Montgassard. It became clear that the game of the Holy Land was not decided by a single battle, no matter how miraculous. It was a war of attrition, strategy, and human endurance, with leaders like Baldwin shaping the narrative in ways that would be felt long after his body could no longer fight. In many ways, Baldwin's victory became the prologue to a larger story, one that would include the rise of new military elites, shifting alliances across the eastern Mediterranean, and the stage for legendary confrontations between European crusaders and Muslim forces that had learned hard lessons from Montgassard. The balance of power had shifted, even temporarily, and the chessboard of the Levant was reset. As the Crusader states consolidated, rebuilt, and fortified, Saladin's shadow loomed. But the story was far from over. The next chapters would see him return with a vengeance, armies marching across familiar plains, seeking to avenge humiliation and to rewrite the fate of Jerusalem once and for all. Baldwin's time was limited, but his actions ensured that history would remember him, not just for a single battle, but for the larger impact he had on the region's unfolding saga of war, politics, and the clash of civilizations. After Montgassard, a fragile calm settled over the region, but it was a deceptive quiet. Saladin, humiliated yet unbroken, returned to Egypt and Syria, gathering survivors, recruiting new troops, and reinforcing his supply lines. The defeat had exposed weaknesses in his army, and he knew that sheer numbers alone could no longer guarantee victory against a clever and determined opponent. Every Mamluk, every cavalry regiment, every general learned from the chaos that Baldwin IV had inflicted. Saladin began drilling his forces with renewed intensity, emphasizing discipline, coordination, and the importance of morale, a direct response to the psychological collapse his army had suffered. Meanwhile, Baldwin's victory at Montgassard had inspired confidence across the Crusader states. Lords in Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre pledged support, seeing that the impossible could be achieved with courage and leadership. Baldwin, despite his worsening condition, continued to issue commands, using messengers and advisors to project his presence across the kingdom. He oversaw the fortification of castles, stockpiling food and weapons, and training new knights and infantry in the tactics that had turned 500 men into a conquering force. His court became a hive of preparation, the memory of Montgassard a rallying point for discipline and determination. But beyond the walls of the Crusader states, new threats began to stir. The political landscape of the Levant was fragile. Muslim emirs, some loyal to Saladin, others opportunistic, began maneuvering for position. Byzantine envoys observed from the north, assessing which side might offer the best advantage. European crusaders, hearing tales of Baldwin's miraculous victory, began to arrive, bringing reinforcements, wealth, and mercenaries eager for glory. Baldwin understood that these forces, though welcome, were also unpredictable. Integrating them into the fragile military network required skill, diplomacy, and foresight, lest they cause as much trouble as they solved. Saladin, ever patient, bided his time. His goal was no longer a blind, overwhelming charge. He would plan meticulously, ensuring that when he struck again, there would be no chance for a repeat of Montgassard. Reconnaissance missions scoured the terrain, alliances were tested, and every village along the coastal and inland routes became a node in a growing intelligence network. Saladin's mind was already calculating the moves of Baldwin, anticipating the strategy of someone whose audacity had already humbled him once. The chessboard of the Levant was set again, with Baldwin's forces on one side and Saladin's rebuilding army on the other. During this period, Baldwin also faced personal challenges. His leprosy worsened, his blindness complete, and his mobility nearly gone. Yet he refused to surrender his authority. Advisors carried him from chamber to chamber, while he dictated orders with precision. His knights, still loyal after Montgassard, treated every command as gospel, inspired by the memory of what their king had accomplished. Baldwin's reputation alone became a force multiplier. The morale of the Crusaders remained high, while Saladin's enemies feared that audacity and intelligence could still outmatch sheer numbers. As months passed, small skirmishes, raids, and intelligence-gathering missions marked the ongoing struggle. Baldwin directed responses to Saladin's probing attacks, setting ambushes, intercepting convoys, and keeping the Sultan's forces off balance. Each victory, however minor, reinforced the legend of the Leper King, ensuring that his shadow stretched across the battlefield even when he could not physically fight. In essence, this period was the calm before the next storm, a tense, high-stakes game of preparation, positioning, and psychological warfare. Baldwin had secured a miracle once, but the region's fate remained precarious. Saladin was learning, adapting, rebuilding, and preparing to return, not as a humbled conqueror, but as a calculated and relentless force determined to reclaim his honor and his territory. And so, the stage was set for the next great chapter. The escalation of the conflict, the maneuvering of armies across the Levant, and the subtle, deadly interplay of strategy, faith, and human will. Baldwin's victory had bought time, but the war was far from over, and both sides knew that the next encounter could change the course of history entirely. By the spring following Montgassard, Baldwin IV's court was a hive of planning. Though he could no longer ride into battle, his mind remained razor-sharp. He began orchestrating a network of fortifications and intelligence that stretched across the kingdom. Each castle, from Tyre in the north to Ascalon in the south, was reinforced, provisions stockpiled, and garrisons trained not only in combat, but in communication. Messengers, signal fires, and scouts ensured that no movement of Saladin's army would go unnoticed. Baldwin understood that his strength lay not in numbers, but in anticipation, preparation, and the ability to strike decisively at the right moment. Saladin, meanwhile, was consolidating his forces after Montgassard. Though humiliated, he retained immense resources in Egypt and Syria. He took time to rebuild morale among his surviving troops, recruit new Mamluks, and retrain his cavalry to avoid the panic that had destroyed them before. He studied the battlefield reports, noting the tactical brilliance of Baldwin, and resolved that next time, mistakes would be minimal. He began a series of calculated incursions into border territories, testing the defenses of the Crusader states, while his spies mapped the roads, ravines, and river crossings, looking for vulnerabilities. Every engagement was measured, every step toward Jerusalem deliberate. Baldwin's response was equally meticulous. Rather than meeting Saladin head-on, he emphasized mobility, intelligence, and timing. He positioned small, fast-moving units along likely routes, ready to harass supply lines, ambush raiding parties, and delay the Sultan's advance without committing to a full battle. Baldwin knew the psychological value of showing that even a weakened kingdom could respond with lethal efficiency. He aimed to make Saladin second-guess every move, to introduce hesitation into the mind of a commander who had never known defeat before Montgassard. During this period, Baldwin also trained a new generation of knights and commanders. Men like Raymond of Tripoli, Balian of Ibelin, and Guy of Lusignan were groomed to take responsibility for field command, with Baldwin mentoring them in the principles of deception, timing, and morale that had defined Montgassard. Baldwin's genius now lay not just in personal courage, but in creating a command network capable of responding to overwhelming threats even in his absence. Saladin's first counteroffensive came quietly. Rather than marching a massive army directly toward Jerusalem, he tested the Crusader defenses along the coast and inland passes, attempting to draw Baldwin's forces into rash engagement. Raids struck smaller towns. Caravans were intercepted and pressure mounted on the frontier garrisons. Baldwin, anticipating such moves, countered with well-timed ambushes, striking at isolated units, inflicting losses, and then fading back to defensive positions. Each action reinforced the message. The Crusader kingdom, though outnumbered, was far from powerless. These maneuvers built tension across the Levant. Christian and Muslim chroniclers alike noted that the region was in a state of nervous expectation. Every skirmish a test, every movement a potential prelude to a massive confrontation. Baldwin's health continued to decline, yet the legends of Montgassard and his continued strategic brilliance kept morale high among his knights and terrifying his enemies. Saladin, learning the lessons of his earlier defeat, approached cautiously, measuring every advance, unwilling to commit prematurely against a foe who had already done the impossible. In essence, the stage for the next great encounter was set. Baldwin, crippled but commanding, was orchestrating a defensive network and training a new generation of leaders. Saladin, experienced but humiliated, was rebuilding, recalibrating, and preparing to reclaim the initiative. Each side watched the other, testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and preparing for the moment when history would demand another decisive clash. The months following Baldwin IV's careful maneuvering became a tense dance across the Levant. Saladin's forces probed constantly, raiding villages, striking lightly at Crusader patrols, and attempting to map weaknesses in the defensive network Baldwin had so meticulously established. Each incursion was met with a calculated response. Ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and targeted counterstrikes that inflicted losses far beyond what the Sultan expected. Baldwin's genius was evident not in a single moment of heroics like Montgassard, but in sustaining a psychological advantage over an army 10 times the size of his own. Knights who had survived the great victory now found themselves in a war of patience, endurance, and cunning. Cavalry units scouted endlessly, using ravines, hills, and forests to their advantage. Supply lines were intercepted, communication networks tested, and Saladin's raiders began to hesitate, wary of traps that seemed almost invisible. Baldwin's advisors, once skeptical of his health and leadership, now moved with quiet reverence, knowing that the Leper King's orders, though dictated from a litter or throne chair, could decide the fate of entire fortresses. Meanwhile, Saladin's patience was growing thin. He could not afford to waste time with minor skirmishes forever. Each day he delayed. The Crusader states grew stronger, new knights arrived from Europe, and the memory of Montgassard kept his commanders cautious. Yet he did not act rashly. This was a man who had rebuilt empires through patience and strategy, who had spent years uniting Egypt and Syria under his rule. He began preparing a second, more comprehensive campaign against Jerusalem, one that would combine infantry, cavalry, and siege engines designed to crush Baldwin's defenses and reclaim the city he had failed to take the first time. Baldwin, aware of the inevitability of confrontation, began to focus on training his knights in coordinated maneuvers designed to exploit terrain, delay large forces, and maximize psychological impact. The lessons of Montgassard were studied obsessively: timing, surprise, the use of narrow passes, and the morale effect of audacious action. Baldwin knew that in another major battle, sheer courage alone would not be enough. It had to be combined with careful preparation, deception, and understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. Political tension mirrored the military tension. Alliances in the region were fragile. Local lords debated where their loyalties lay, and Baldwin used diplomacy as effectively as he had used his sword, reinforcing friendships, securing reinforcements, and creating a web of intelligence that would alert him to Saladin's every move. Each message, each letter, each report became a piece of a larger puzzle, a map of anticipation that allowed a king confined to his chamber to exert influence over a region teeming with armies, spies, and ambition. And yet, despite all this preparation, Baldwin's body was betraying him. The leprosy progressed, his blindness complete, his mobility limited to a litter carried by loyal knights. Every decision, every order came at a personal cost. But Baldwin understood the stakes. Jerusalem, the kingdom, and the memory of Montcassar depended on his continued guidance. Each day was a battle in itself, and the war was far from over. The stage was set for the next great escalation. Saladin would soon return, not as a humiliated conqueror, but as a calculating general with the full weight of his rebuilt army. Baldwin, weakened but brilliant, would marshal his remaining knights, militia, and allies to meet him. The tension across the Levant was almost tangible, the calm of the period a deceptive prelude to the storm that was coming, a storm that would test not just courage, but strategy, loyalty, and the very limits of human endurance to be why the following summer. Saladin had rebuilt his forces into a disciplined and formidable army. Estimates suggest he could field close to 50,000 men, a combination of seasoned Mamluks, Syrian cavalry, and infantry drawn from across his empire. Unlike his first campaign, he did not rush blindly toward Jerusalem. Every movement was deliberate. Scouts mapped the valleys, passes, and plains surrounding the city. Siege engineers prepared equipment capable of battering even the strongest fortifications. The Sultan knew Baldwin had learned from Montcassar and that any misstep could be disastrous. Baldwin, though blind and crippled by leprosy, anticipated the inevitability of this confrontation. From his throne chair in Jerusalem, he studied maps, plotted supply routes, and reviewed intelligence reports brought by scouts and messengers. He instructed his knights to strengthen positions at narrow passes, hilltops, and natural choke points. Every farm, ridge, and ravine within miles of the city became a potential weapon in his hands. Baldwin understood the psychology of war as acutely as the tactics. He knew that fear, surprise, and confidence could shift the outcome even against an army 10 times the size of his own, that Saladin's forces began moving slowly north from Egypt and southern Palestine. His scouts reported the well-fortified positions Baldwin had prepared, and for the first time, the Sultan faced hesitation among his commanders. They had expected Jerusalem's defenses to crumble under pressure, but Baldwin's meticulous preparations made the city a fortress network connected by intelligence, traps, and ready strike forces. Skirmishes occurred as raiding parties were intercepted, supply lines ambushed, and small cavalry units struck at vulnerable detachments, forcing Saladin to respond cautiously. The Baldwin strategy relied on subtlety and timing rather than outright confrontation. His forces remained mostly within fortified positions, using small units to harass and delay, feeding intelligence back to the king. Every failed raid, every disrupted supply convoy added to the Sultan's growing frustration. Baldwin's genius was to force Saladin into a psychological trap. He could not simply crush the city. He had to commit to cautious, deliberate action, giving Baldwin the advantage of patience. At the same time, Baldwin's knights trained tirelessly. Although reduced in number, they became expert at rapid deployment, fighting in narrow passes, and exploiting terrain. Baldwin's experience at Montcassar became the guiding principle. Numbers were secondary. Morale, cohesion, and audacity were decisive. His officers were taught to anticipate enemy movements, set ambushes, and exploit every hesitation. Baldwin's personal presence, though mediated through messengers and advisors, remained central. Knights who had fought under him at Montcassar continued to follow his directives with unwavering loyalty, inspired by the memory of the impossible victory. Saladin, recognizing the stalemate, began attempting feints, trying to lure Baldwin into a decisive engagement. But Baldwin refused to be baited. His forces held positions, struck quickly where necessary, and then melted back into the fortified network. Skirmishes escalated into tense cat-and-mouse games across the countryside, with both sides testing the other's limits. Baldwin's ability to anticipate Saladin's moves and exploit terrain, even while confined to his chair, became a source of awe for both Christian and Muslim observers by midsummer. It was clear the next great confrontation would not be a simple march on Jerusalem. Saladin had rebuilt an army, but Baldwin had transformed the city and surrounding region into a defensive web capable of forcing the Sultan into mistakes. The psychological advantage of Montcassard, combined with Baldwin's careful planning, created a scenario in which Saladin could no longer rely purely on brute force. The stage was set for a campaign where every decision, every maneuver, every deployment of troops could tip the balance. The tension across the Levant was palpable. From the hills of Galilee to the plains south of Ascalon, armies moved like chess pieces, each aware that the next decisive move could determine the fate of kingdoms. Baldwin IV, the Leper King confined to his chair, remained at the center of this grand strategy, proving once again that even a frail body could command a region's destiny through intellect, foresight, and unwavering will. By late summer, the heat of the Levant sun baked the hills and plains outside Jerusalem, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain and olive groves that had witnessed decades of conflict. Saladin's rebuilt forces, now well-disciplined and reinforced with new Mamluks and Syrian cavalry, advanced cautiously from the south. Unlike his first campaign, there was no overconfidence this time. Every commander understood that Baldwin IV, though physically crippled, remained a genius strategist. Every village, every ravine, every road leading toward Jerusalem was under surveillance, and Saladin's scouts quickly realized that the Christian kingdom had transformed into a network of interconnected strongholds rather than a single city to be taken at a stroke. That Baldwin's planning had been exhaustive. From his throne chair, he directed the positioning of small rapid response units along key roads and passes, using intelligence gathered from local farmers, spies, and knights dispatched from Tyre and Tripoli. He knew that Saladin would avoid a direct siege of Jerusalem initially, instead attempting to cut off supplies, probe for weaknesses, and draw the Crusaders into a premature battle. Baldwin's response was to deny him these opportunities, creating the illusion that the kingdom was smaller and weaker than it really was, while his knights and infantry lay hidden in ravines, forests, and behind hills, ready to strike with precision. The first clash occurred near a small village on the approaches from Ascalon. Saladin sent a detachment of 2,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry to seize the area, intending to secure supply lines for the main army. Baldwin had anticipated this. As a Muslim detachment moved down the narrow road flanked by rocky ridges, they were suddenly confronted by hidden Christian archers and spearmen, positioned in a series of staggered ambushes. Arrows rained from above, horses faltered on the uneven ground, and infantry armed with pikes and crossbows struck with lethal efficiency. In less than an hour, nearly a quarter of Saladin's detachment was either killed, captured, or routed. Saladin, observing the skirmish from a hilltop with his commanders, realized the pattern immediately. Baldwin was not committing his full force. He was forcing the Sultan to fight on terrain carefully selected to neutralize numerical superiority. It was a psychological play as much as a tactical one. Saladin's initial rage and frustration at Montcassard had been remembered by every general in his army. And now, facing the Leper King's careful planning, hesitation began to creep into even the most seasoned Mamluks' minds. Soldiers whispered about the reputation of the boy who had defied all odds, the king whose hands were ravaged by disease, but whose intellect guided armies like an unseen hand. Baldwin, meanwhile, coordinated reinforcements with astonishing precision. Scouts had reported a potential flanking attempt by a secondary Muslim unit approaching from the west. Baldwin ordered a detachment of knights, mounted lightly and supported by infantry, to intercept. The maneuver was executed flawlessly, with the knights appearing from hidden hillsides and striking the enemy's flank. The combination of direct ambush and flanking assault forced Saladin's detachment into full retreat, leaving supplies and weapons behind. For the Crusader Knights, it was a morale boost reminiscent of Montgassard, proof that even a diminished force could still dictate the terms of engagement. As the summer days stretched on, a pattern emerged. Saladin's army, massive and disciplined though it was, moved with extreme caution. Baldwin's strategy emphasized patience and precise timing, striking only where terrain and numbers could be leveraged to his advantage. Supply convoys were raided, bridges were destroyed, and reconnaissance missions often ended in traps that inflicted heavy casualties. Each success reinforced the psychological advantage Baldwin held, proving that Montgassard had not been a miracle, but the product of a mind capable of calculating the improbable and turning it into reality. Political ramifications also unfolded alongside these military maneuvers. Word of the failed skirmishes reached the courts of neighboring Muslim rulers and European powers alike. Some emirs questioned Saladin's judgment, whispering that the Christian king's audacity and tactical skill had exposed weaknesses even in his disciplined army. European crusaders, hearing news of Baldwin's continued brilliance, began sending additional reinforcements, money, and supplies to the kingdom, eager to participate in what was becoming legend. Baldwin leveraged this, integrating new arrivals into the command structure carefully, ensuring that every unit acted cohesively while keeping them inspired by stories of Montgassard and the psychological impact of small but decisive victories. By mid-autumn, Saladin realized that any further advance would require committing to a major siege or decisive engagement. The repeated small losses had not only reduced his numbers, but begun to wear on morale. Baldwin had effectively turned the terrain into an ally. Hills, ravines, narrow passes, and fortified villages all became obstacles that slowed the Sultan's advance and forced him into predictable movements. Baldwin's ability to direct these maneuvers from his throne, despite blindness and leprosy, astonished both his allies and enemies. Knights carried messages across the front lines, executed ambushes exactly as ordered, and adapted to changing conditions on the battlefield, all under Baldwin's strategic direction. During this time, Baldwin also strengthened intelligence networks, planting agents in villages near Saladin's encampments. Reports of troop morale, logistical issues, and potential internal dissent allowed Baldwin to anticipate the Sultan's decisions with unnerving accuracy. This intelligence-driven strategy was a continuation of the psychological warfare that had defined Montgassard. If Saladin believed he faced a prepared and cunning opponent at every turn, hesitation and overcaution would play into Baldwin's hands. In essence, these months of skirmishes, maneuvers, and strategic posturing were a prelude to a much larger confrontation. Baldwin IV, though physically ailing, transformed the kingdom into a living battlefield, one in which terrain, timing, morale, and surprise were deployed as weapons as lethal as any sword. Saladin, rebuilding not only his army but his reputation, faced the greatest challenge of his career, to take Jerusalem against a foe whose brilliance had already rewritten the rules of warfare. The stage was now fully set. The next major engagement would test every lesson learned at Montgassard and every precaution Baldwin had put in place. The outcome could once again redefine the balance of power in the Levant. Both sides understood the stakes. The honor, the survival, and the future of kingdoms rested on the decisions that would soon be made on the battlefield. As autumn deepened into the golden haze of late October, the land around Jerusalem became a theater of mounting tension. Saladin, having rebuilt his forces meticulously after Montgassard, now commanded a fully organized army estimated at 50,000 men, composed of elite Mamluk cavalry, disciplined Syrian infantry, and contingents of Egyptian levies. His siege engines, catapults, mangonels, and battering rams were assembled with care, each meticulously tested for the coming campaign. Unlike his reckless confidence at Montgassard, he approached the Crusader kingdom with the caution of a man scarred by a single defeat, knowing that even minor errors could unravel his entire effort. Baldwin IV, though blind and physically decayed by leprosy, observed the movements of the Sultan's forces with unerring focus. From the walls of Jerusalem, he oversaw dispatches from scouts, messengers, and spies, each detailing the position, formation, and morale of Saladin's approaching army. Baldwin's strategy now relied on the principles he had refined over years of leadership. Control the terrain, force the enemy into predictable patterns, and strike at moments when overconfidence or fatigue could be exploited. Saladin's advance toward the outskirts of Jerusalem began with probing attacks, sending small detachments to test defensive lines, observe reactions, and gather intelligence. Baldwin anticipated each of these movements. Hidden infantry armed with long spears and crossbows occupied hills, ridges, and narrow valleys along likely routes of advance. Cavalry units, lightly mounted for speed, were stationed to intercept and harass any overextended units. Every skirmish was calculated, designed to inflict casualties while feeding psychological pressure back to the Muslim commanders. The impression that the kingdom was small but deadly, that every inch of terrain concealed prepared traps. The first significant engagement occurred along the Wadi Musa Valley, a natural choke point leading into the approaches of Jerusalem. Saladin deployed 5,000 cavalry to secure the high ground and establish a base for artillery placement. Baldwin, anticipating this, orchestrated a multi-layered trap. From hidden positions, 800 infantry armed with long spears and crossbows unleashed volleys on the exposed cavalry. The first arrows tore into the advancing horses, causing confusion and panic. The infantry then withdrew into wooded ravines, luring the cavalry into narrow passages where they could no longer maneuver freely. Simultaneously, Baldwin's knights, deployed as a rapid response force, struck the flanks of Saladin's isolated units. Their charge was precise, swift, and devastating. Horses surged, lances found their marks, and Mamluk warriors, despite rigorous training, were forced into chaotic retreat. The combination of terrain, timing, and coordinated assault turned what should have been a routine reconnaissance in force into a costly disaster for the Sultan. Reports later suggested that up to 1,500 men were killed or captured in this single encounter, a shocking loss for a commander of Saladin's experience. Saladin himself observed the unfolding disaster from his command position. Unlike Montgessard, where overconfidence had blinded him, he now recognized Baldwin's genius as fully operational. Every move of the Crusader army seemed anticipated, every ambush perfectly timed. He realized that he was no longer facing a static force behind city walls, but a kingdom-wide network of defenses, each interconnected and controlled by a mind that refused to be limited by physical weakness. The humiliation of Montgessard still lingered, and now the fear of repetition weighed heavily on his commanders and troops alike, that Baldwin's brilliance extended beyond battlefield maneuvers. He coordinated supply lines, ensured communication between dispersed units, and employed deception. He had small teams spread across the countryside, sending false reports of troop movements and leaving traces of activity that suggested greater forces than existed. Saladin's scouts reported these phantom units repeatedly, feeding anxiety and slowing decision-making. Baldwin understood that psychological warfare could achieve what sheer numbers often could not, as the days stretched into weeks, skirmishes multiplied. Saladin attempted several coordinated attacks, each more carefully planned than the last, but Baldwin's foresight, use of terrain, and strategic patience neutralized them. Bridges were destroyed just before they could be crossed, villages abandoned, but booby traps slowed advances, and ambushes struck at the supply lines, forcing the Sultan to divert forces constantly. The Crusader knights, motivated by Baldwin's presence and reputation, executed orders with precision, while infantry and militia added critical support. Meanwhile, the political dimension of the campaign intensified. Emirs under Saladin's command began voicing dissent, frustrated by repeated failures despite overwhelming numbers. Some began questioning whether the young Leper King's reputation alone could justify the losses they had suffered. Baldwin, aware of these fractures, deployed spies and envoys to subtly exploit rivalries within Saladin's coalition, feeding misinformation and exaggerating the kingdom's strength. Even the smallest hints of instability in the Sultan's ranks could have outsized effects on morale and cohesion. A strategy Baldwin wielded like a weapon. By late November, the situation reached a precarious equilibrium. Saladin's army, though vast, had suffered attrition from skirmishes, terrain, and psychological stress. Baldwin's forces, though smaller, remained intact, highly motivated, and strategically positioned. The Sultan faced a dilemma: commit fully to a siege or risk incremental attacks that could bleed his forces further. Baldwin, meanwhile, prepared for the moment when Saladin would finally overcommit, aware that only a decisive engagement could resolve the campaign. Every ambush, every maneuver, every calculated risk over the past months had been designed to set the conditions for this eventual confrontation. The Levant now held its breath. Both armies were poised for a confrontation that would test not only courage but patience, strategy, and foresight. Baldwin IV, the blind and dying king, remained at the center of it all, orchestrating a kingdom-wide defense from his throne, turning every challenge into an opportunity. Saladin, cautious yet determined, advanced with the knowledge that only a masterstroke could overcome the genius of a boy who had already defied history. As December approached, the Levant settled into a tense, almost eerie quiet. Saladin's massive army camped along the approaches to Jerusalem, stretching miles across the hills and valleys. The Sultan's men, disciplined and well-fed, drilled daily, tested siege engines, and coordinated cavalry movements. But even the most hardened Mamluks could not escape a creeping unease. The memory of Montgassard haunted every officer. The boy king, crippled by disease, had turned 500 knights into an unstoppable storm. Now, with Baldwin IV directing from the throne, the same mind orchestrated the defenses of a kingdom-wide battlefield, transforming every ravine, ridge, and pass into a potential death trap. That Baldwin's preparations were meticulous. Despite his blindness, he mapped every likely approach with absolute precision. His scouts had detailed reports on Saladin's camp layout, supply routes, and troop movements. The Leper King coordinated with his knights to stage feints, dummy positions, and false signals that suggested vulnerability where none existed. Troops were rotated to rest while others held positions, ensuring that morale remained high even as they watched the massive Muslim army preparing for siege. Baldwin's mastery of psychological warfare had become as lethal as his tactical genius. He knew that fear, uncertainty, and anticipation could magnify the effectiveness of every attack. In Jerusalem itself, fortifications were reinforced. Towers were manned with crossbowmen and archers, walls strengthened with stone and timber, and catapults positioned to cover every approach. Baldwin ensured that supply depots were hidden or relocated, so that Saladin spies would consistently underestimate the Crusaders' resilience. Beyond the city, the surrounding terrain was carefully manipulated. Ravines were deepened in strategic locations, narrow passes obstructed, and hills cleared of cover to allow for maximum visibility of enemy movements. Each preparation was a puzzle piece, designed to guide Saladin's forces into positions favorable to Baldwin's counterattack. Saladin, meanwhile, exhibited a rare combination of patience and frustration. He had rebuilt his army meticulously, training thousands of Mamluk cavalry and reinforcing his supply lines. He advanced slowly, probing the outer defenses, launching small-scale attacks to test for weaknesses and waiting for Baldwin to make the first mistake. But the Crusader king offered none. Each maneuver Baldwin orchestrated was calculated to suggest caution, vulnerability, or scarcity of forces, yet every perceived weakness was an illusion, bait leading toward carefully prepared ambushes. The skirmishes of the past weeks had already taken a toll on Saladin's army. Men who had marched for months through rocky hills and narrow passes were fatigued. Horses grew weary despite rotation, and supplies, though abundant, were consumed faster than expected due to repeated harassment by Baldwin's knights and infantry. The Sultan began ordering rotations, sending units to guard supply lines while others maintained positions near Jerusalem. But each movement risked dispersing his forces, opening gaps that Baldwin would exploit. Baldwin's network of scouts provided constant updates. He now knew where every major contingent of Saladin's army was positioned, which officers were commanding which units, and even had reports of morale among key regiments. The Leper King's mind, sharp as ever, began to weave a plan for the next decisive strike. He would not wait for Saladin to attack the city directly. Instead, he would create conditions for a crushing ambush outside the walls, using the terrain to neutralize numerical superiority. The goal was clear: force the Sultan to overextend, then strike with precision, as had been done at Montcassard, but on a far larger, more controlled scale. Knights and infantry were briefed on the upcoming maneuvers. Baldwin's instructions were clear: patience, coordination, and absolute discipline. Every unit was assigned a specific role: archers in hills to harass and slow enemy cavalry, infantry in concealed positions to block advances through ravines, and mounted knights ready to strike at critical moments. Signals were established for coordination. Banners, trumpets, and prearranged sounds allowed the Leper King's forces to move in near-perfect unison, despite their dispersed positions. The psychological impact of Baldwin's preparations cannot be overstated. Saladin scouts began reporting phantom movements, the appearance of troops where none existed, feigned patrols, and deliberate misinformation. Confidence among the Sultan's commanders wavered. Men who had marched for months without incident now questioned whether they could trust their eyes. Every false signal, every hidden unit, reinforced the impression that the Crusader kingdom was larger, more prepared, and far deadlier than it appeared. Baldwin himself remained a central figure, even if physically unable to ride. Knights carried messages between posts, executed sudden flanking maneuvers, and relayed intelligence with uncanny precision. His presence, though indirect, was felt everywhere. Soldiers spoke of the Leper King with reverence, comparing him to a spectral general who could see everything, anticipate every threat, and manipulate the battlefield like a master strategist moving chess pieces. His directives ensured that the Christian forces maintained cohesion, coordination, and morale even as the overwhelming shadow of Saladin's army loomed ever closer to by mid-December. The final pieces were in place. Saladin's forces had advanced as far as the outer hills, unaware that Baldwin had anticipated the approach and prepared the battlefield for a decisive encounter. The Sultan had to make a choice: commit fully to an attack and risk being funneled into traps, or hold back and risk the Christian forces strengthening further. Baldwin, confident in his network and the loyalty of his knights, waited, knowing that any miscalculation by the Sultan would provide the opportunity for another legendary reversal. The tension was almost tangible. From Jerusalem to the surrounding hills, every movement of men, horses, and equipment became a prelude to catastrophe or glory. Baldwin's genius lay not in seeking immediate confrontation, but in setting the stage so that when Saladin acted, the consequences would unfold exactly as he intended. The entire campaign had become a high-stakes game of patience, strategy, and psychological warfare, one that would test the limits of endurance, courage, and intellect on both sides. As December's sun rose pale over the hills outside Jerusalem, the land seemed deceptively calm. Saladin's army stretched in long lines across the countryside, its banners fluttering in the cold morning breeze, the rhythmic clatter of armored horses echoing across valleys. The Mamluks, elite and disciplined, had been drilled to perfection, their confidence built on victories across Egypt, Syria, and the Levant. Yet beneath that confidence, an unease simmered. Rumors of Baldwin IV's genius, whispered among men who had survived Montcassard, spread like wildfire, infecting morale with tension. Baldwin, though blind and crippled by leprosy, remained fully aware of every movement. From the throne in Jerusalem, he orchestrated a network of scouts, riders, and messengers. Every ridge, every ravine, and every road had been observed, mapped, and prepared for exploitation. The Leper King had positioned infantry in hidden gullies, archers on hillsides, and small, fast-moving cavalry units ready to strike at critical points. It was a trap in depth. The battlefield itself was a weapon designed to channel Saladin's forces into zones of maximum vulnerability. Saladin, believing he had detected a weakness in the Christian positions, ordered a coordinated advance along the Wadi Musa Valley, intending to push toward Jerusalem while keeping a secure flank along open plains. Columns of cavalry and infantry moved forward, each step confident but unaware that Baldwin had already anticipated their path. The valley, appearing wide and open from a distance, had been prepared. Hidden infantry lined the slopes, sharpened stakes were planted in concealed positions, and crossbowmen waited in the shadows of olive groves to disrupt the advancing formations. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Saladin's forces moved with practiced precision, confident in their numerical superiority. But as the leading cavalry approached the narrowest section of the valley, chaos erupted. Arrows rained from the hillsides, striking both horse and rider. Cavalry stumbled over concealed stakes, breaking formations in a matter of seconds. Infantry units attempting to support their comrades found themselves ambushed from the flanks by hidden Christian soldiers wielding long spears. Shouts and screams filled the air as men struggled to reform lines that were already collapsing under the pressure of surprise and terrain. Baldwin, through his network of riders, signaled the hidden cavalry to exploit the confusion. Mounted knights surged down side paths, striking the exposed flanks of Saladin's forces. The coordinated attack came from multiple directions at once. Arrows from above, spears from the sides, and charging knights from unexpected angles. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers trained to follow orders and maintain discipline faltered as the realization sank in. The Christian army had anticipated every move, and what seemed like open ground was now a lethal trap. For Saladin, the sight was almost unbelievable. From his vantage point, he could see columns of Mamluk cavalry faltering, their elite ranks breaking as hidden obstacles and sudden attacks shredded cohesion. His commanders attempted to form new lines, but the terrain funneled the troops into narrow corridors, where coordinated maneuvers became impossible. Horses reared in panic, men fell into ravines, and cries of confusion echoed across the battlefield. Baldwin had achieved precisely what he intended. A force 30 times smaller than the enemy was creating disproportionate havoc that Baldwin's knights pressed the advantage. Though physically unable to ride unassisted, the Leper King's strategic mind guided every action. Cavalry units charged in wedges to exploit gaps in the enemy lines, while infantry sealed escape routes, channeling retreating soldiers into narrow ravines where they could be trapped or destroyed. The precision and timing of the assault were extraordinary. Units separated by miles acted in perfect concert, a reflection of Baldwin's careful orchestration as panic spread through Saladin's army. His elite Mamluks tried to rally the front lines, but hesitation proved contagious. Soldiers witnessing comrades falling, being ambushed, or driven into ravines became increasingly fearful. Even experienced officers struggled to enforce discipline. Baldwin's feints, ambushes, and strategic placement of forces had achieved what brute strength could not: psychological domination. The Mamluks, trained for battlefield mastery, now reacted with hesitation, fear, and confusion. By midday, the valley was a scene of chaos. Saladin's formations, once disciplined and formidable, were fragmented. Cavalry and infantry collided in disarray. Horses panicked under arrow fire, and hidden infantry exploited every exposed flank. Baldwin's forces, fewer in number but perfectly positioned, pressed relentlessly. The Leper King's strategic patience paid off. The enemy was now engaging on his terms, forced into traps that magnified the effectiveness of every knight, spearman, and archer. Saladin himself mounted a swift inspection of the battlefield, attempting to rally his forces, but even the sight of his personal command created no immediate order. Units scattered into ravines or retreated into forests, further complicating coordination. The Sultan's elite guard, witnessing the unexpected collapse of frontline troops, began to hesitate. Baldwin's plan was succeeding beyond expectation. The numerical advantage of Saladin's army was nullified by terrain, anticipation, and psychological pressure. Throughout the morning and into early afternoon, skirmishes escalated into full-blown engagements along multiple fronts. Baldwin's forces struck with lethal timing, exploiting every weakness and maintaining relentless pressure. Archers fired from concealed positions, knights charged precisely into exposed flanks, and infantry sealed avenues of retreat. Saladin's men, exhausted from extended marches and continuous harassment, began breaking ranks in significant numbers. For the first time in years, the sword of Islam seemed vulnerable, not because of inferior skill or equipment, but because of a mind who had transformed adversity into overwhelming strategic advantage. By late afternoon, the stage was set for a confrontation that could rival Montcassard in magnitude. Saladin's forces, though still formidable in number, were disorganized and exhausted. Baldwin's knights, guided by years of experience and absolute discipline, were poised to deliver a decisive blow. The Leper King, despite blindness and disease, had once again orchestrated a battlefield where terrain, timing, and psychological warfare outweighed the enemy's numerical superiority. Yes, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Wadi Musa Valley. The battlefield had become a living nightmare for Saladin's forces. Horses screamed, soldiers shouted prayers in desperation, and the clash of steel echoed off the hills. What began as a measured advance had devolved into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Baldwin's plan, patient and meticulous, had come to full fruition. He had transformed the terrain, the weather, and the enemy's own assumptions into weapons, orchestrating a trap so perfect it seemed almost supernatural. Hidden infantry, concealed behind olive groves and ridges, surged simultaneously as Baldwin's mounted knights struck in wedges from multiple angles. Every arrow, spear, and charge had been timed to perfection. The elite Mamluks, famed across the Islamic world for their discipline and courage, found themselves disoriented. Units that had never known hesitation now faltered, the momentum of panic cascading down the lines. Cavalry collided with infantry. Officers struggled to reform their scattered troops, and the numerical advantage that should have guaranteed victory became irrelevant. Baldwin, despite his ravaged body, continued to direct the engagement. Messages were relayed via runners and signals. Banners raised, trumpets sounded, riders dashed between positions, ensuring that every unit acted in near-perfect coordination. The Leper King's strategic genius turned small, disciplined formations into sledgehammers that struck deep into Saladin's army, ripping apart cohesion and morale. The Christian knights, despite exhaustion and injuries, moved with a unity and purpose that seemed superhuman. At the center of the valley, Baldwin orchestrated the most audacious maneuver. He had identified a shallow ravine flanked by gentle hills, invisible from a distance, that could channel enemy forces directly into a kill zone. Archers and infantry occupied the ridges, crossbows loaded and spears braced. Baldwin signaled his knights to charge at precisely the right moment. As Saladin's cavalry entered the funnel, the traps snapped shut. Crossbows fired in synchronized volleys, arrows striking both men and horses. Spears bristled across the path, and Baldwin's knights hit the flanks, sending waves of panic through the front lines. Soldiers screamed as horses tripped and fell. Ranks collapsed in confusion. Retreat became entrapment. Even Saladin's personal guard, the 2,000 elite Mamluks who had never fled, found themselves confronted by the unexpected. Panic, once confined to the front, spread like wildfire. Officers attempted to rally troops, but confusion and fear overwhelmed discipline. Cavalry turned inward, colliding with infantry, while men sought escape in every direction. Baldwin's forces exploited every crack, every hesitation, and every instinctive fear, pressing relentlessly. The psychological toll on Saladin's army was catastrophic. The elite units that had never yielded now fled in disarray. Horses broke from fear, trampled soldiers, and scattered into woods or down ravines. Every retreat magnified chaos. Every scream echoed fear. Every collapse spread panic. Baldwin's knights pursued with relentless precision, cutting down isolated groups and maintaining the illusion of forces materializing from nowhere. Hidden infantry struck at flanks and rears, creating the impression that the Christian army was everywhere at once. Saladin himself realized the disaster unfolding before him. From his command position, he could see the elite of his army scattering, the organized columns breaking into chaos. Years of victories, careful planning, and disciplined training now counted for nothing. His cavalry, trained to perfection, were either dead, trapped, or fleeing. The sight of knights charging seemingly impossibly across the terrain, coordinated with infantry in hidden positions, left him stunned. The golden mace in his hand felt impotent. The battlefield had become a place where numbers were meaningless, where fear and faith ruled over skill and experience. The Baldwin strategy combined mobility, terrain, and psychological manipulation to perfection. The Mamluk regiments tried to regroup, only to find themselves funneled into narrow passes where they were slaughtered. Horses carrying retreating soldiers stumbled into ravines, their riders crushed beneath hooves. Every tactical decision Baldwin had made over months, terrain preparation, feints, hidden positions, and psychological operations, culminated in this crescendo. The valley became a vortex of destruction, with Saladin's forces caught at every turn at by late afternoon. The Mamluk cavalry was shattered. Infantry units had been decimated or captured, and the battlefield was littered with corpses, broken weapons, and overturned horses. Baldwin's forces, though exhausted and outnumbered, remained cohesive and deadly. Every unit executed its role with precision, exploiting panic and disarray to devastating effect. The Leper King's vision had turned an impossible numerical disadvantage into a decisive, almost mythic victory as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The remnants of Saladin's forces were fleeing in utter disarray. Baldwin's knights pursued relentlessly, striking at command units and isolated groups, leaving destruction in their wake. The elite Mamluks, those who had never before known fear, abandoned even their sultan. Saladin, realizing the battle was lost, mounted a camel to escape, a sight that shattered morale further. Troops who had revered him now fled in panic. The psychological collapse complete. By dusk, Baldwin's forces held the valley. The battlefield, once dominated by Saladin's overwhelming numbers, was now a testament to strategic brilliance, terrain mastery, and the indomitable will of a boy king dying from leprosy. Every surviving Crusader knight, every foot soldier had executed their roles with precision, guided by Baldwin's genius. The impossible had been achieved yet again. A smaller, exhausted force had annihilated a vastly superior army through discipline, preparation, and psychological mastery. As the dust settled over the Wadi Musa Valley, the battlefield told a story of devastation beyond imagination. Saladin's once proud army, the mightiest Muslim force in the Levant, had been shattered. Of 26,000 warriors who marched into battle that morning, fewer than 2,000 survived to see the sunset. The rest lay dead, trampled, suffocated in ravines, or captured. Horses littered the fields, banners lay torn and muddy, and weapons, broken, abandoned, and bloodied, were scattered as far as the eye could see. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, though exhausted, still led his knights and soldiers in the final moments of pursuit and consolidation. Strapped to his horse, his hands bandaged and body ravaged by disease, he had witnessed the impossible. A teenage king, thought doomed by illness, had once again turned the tide of history. Despite his suffering, Baldwin directed the remaining forces, ensuring that the surviving Muslim units were either captured or neutralized. Even in his extreme weakness, his leadership inspired complete loyalty and discipline, qualities that amplified the impact of the victory beyond numbers alone. The physical toll on Baldwin was severe. His body was battered from days of marching and combat. his leprosy having destroyed his strength and sensation. Knights and soldiers assisted him from his horse, carrying him to a safe position atop a hill from which he could survey the aftermath. Even in these moments, Baldwin raised his voice in prayer with his men. Non nobis, Domini, non nobis, sed nomini tua de gloriam. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. The field, surrounded by thousands of corpses, was eerily silent except for the prayers and distant groans of the wounded. Strategically, the victory at Wadi Musa, or what later chroniclers would elevate as the Battle of Mount Gizzard, was staggering. The Christian forces had captured vast quantities of supplies: horses, weapons, gold, siege engines, and food intended to sustain Saladin's army. This windfall not only replenished Jerusalem's defenses, but effectively secured the Crusader kingdom for a decade. Saladin's defeat also destabilized his political alliances. Emirs and commanders questioned his judgment, and the aura of invincibility he had cultivated across Egypt and Syria was irreparably damaged. For 10 years following, Saladin approached the Crusader states with extraordinary caution, acutely aware that numerical superiority alone did not guarantee victory. The psychological impact of the battle resonated far beyond the valley. Christian chroniclers hail Baldwin as a living miracle, the boy king who had defied God's curse and human limitations, a commander whose intellect and courage had saved an entire kingdom. Muslim chroniclers, though attempting to temper the blow, could not deny the scale of the disaster. Many described the defeat as divine punishment, noting that elite troops who had never known fear had been routed by a small, determined force. The impossibility of 500 knights defeating 26,000 warriors became a symbol of faith and courage triumphing over overwhelming odds. Baldwin IV's reign continued for several more years, though his health steadily declined. Blind and increasingly debilitated, he nonetheless remained the guiding force of the kingdom, a symbol of resistance and hope. His victory at Mount Gizzard became the defining moment of his rule, a testament to the power of leadership, strategic genius, and unshakable faith. Even Saladin, in later years, reportedly admitted, "I feared that man more than any army." Baldwin's leadership had not only saved Jerusalem, but demonstrated that a smaller, disciplined, and determined force could overcome vast numerical superiority through intelligence, preparation, and morale. When Baldwin finally died in 1185 at the age of 24, the Crusader kingdom lost not only a king, but a symbol of miraculous resilience. 2 years later, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem, highlighting the tragic irony. The kingdom Baldwin had saved could survive only as long as he lived. Yet the legend endured. The Battle of Mount Gizzard became a case study for military strategists, historians, and leaders, a timeless example of how ingenuity, courage, and faith can defy even the harshest realities. In the end, the story of Baldwin IV and the annihilation of Saladin's army is a lesson in human will, strategy, and the thin line between impossible odds and legendary triumph. A boy with bandaged hands held back the tide of history, proving that leadership, courage, and vision can change the course of empires. The valley of Wadi Musa, once soaked in blood and echoing with the cries of warriors, became a silent monument to the Leper King whose brilliance and faith made the impossible possible.